with what question do I stand here in front of members of the Swedish Parliament? We have heard that our host has submitted a question to the responsible health minister with respect to the outcome of the new pandemic treaty. So the questions of the members of Parliament back to this health minister, and actually the question that should be asked by every member of Parliament to their health ministers and to their governments should be: can you promise to your voters and can you guarantee to your children that the founding principles and all essential elements of our Constitution will be preserved and respected even after the new pandemic treaty and after the amendments of the new health regulations have come into force? Do you know at all what is written in these new agreements? So this is now what I'm going to show you, and we are at the end coming to responses to these questions. What are the core elements of our Constitution, of any of the Constitution following the Western democratic style that was introduced after the French Revolution? All of our constitutions share similar basic values and principles, and I've tried to briefly summarize them as we have learned, all of us learned these principles in school, in high school, gymnasium, but every one of us knows these principles. Number one, of course, the principle that a state has a sovereign power to determine its own political priorities, and the self-determination of the member states to determine the priorities of public tasks. So the sovereignty of the state level, which is reflected by the self-determination on the people's level, the democratic principle, the people's right to vote and to choose their system of power, their system of democracy, and to be correctly informed, which includes the right of undistorted information for the will of the people. These two principles, sovereignty, self-determination, I will come back to these later. Then another principle, checks and balances. Everything must be based, every act of the state must be backed on laws and not on the mere free discretion of a will of a ruler. Will this still be guaranteed? But it is extremely important, and that's the right of free information, free speech, and the prohibition of censorship. So I must say that these fundamental principles are not at disposal. They are never for sale, and we would certainly not allow a small group of people to hand over the key to regulate or even to deactivate one of these principles, and certainly not all of these principles altogether. This is certainly something we would never allow to happen. Let's not forget that these principles were even put in stone after World War I and II by the United Nations as a learning from these two world wars. And I just remind you that the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations starts with the words, we the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and we want to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and the worth of human person. And more specifically, in Article 1, we find this principle of self-determination of people, which means people shall not be governed by a third external power without their free consent. Now, this is just one little example, but there are many more provisions, among others this mandatory international law, which is derived from the principles of the Nuremberg Code, and which says that no one shall be subjected to medical or scientific experimentation without his or her voluntary consent, that has two components. Number one, full, accurate information on all relevant aspects of the decision making. And number two, the liberty, the freedom to come to a free decision without any coercion. And this obviously has been broken during the past 3.5 years in a tremendous large scale. I would say even there's not one single injection happened where we could say that there was a full informed consent with full information, with full liberty being performed. So we must have in mind when we want to go into the details of these agreements. Now, obviously, the head of WHO, he wants to calm us, as the health minister tried to calm our host by saying no country will cede any sovereignty to the WHO. Now, what kind of agreements are we talking about? Please bear in mind there are two legal instruments. Whenever you do a request as a member of parliament to the government or as citizen to the member of parliament, please make sure you refer to both of these legal instruments. This is the new pandemic treaty, of which we have the latest version, 2nd June 2023. And here we have the international health regulations. They are already existing in force since 2007, and which shall be subject to a total revision, to a significant amendment. And these two are being negotiated in parallel with two separate working streams. Now we are in the process of negotiations, but already in May next year at the next World Health Assembly, there will be a vote by all the member states, 194 member states of WHO, about these two different legal instruments. And it is worth noting that for the international health regulations to be accepted and adopted, a simple majority will be sufficient, whereas for the new pandemic treaty, 2/3 majority will be needed. But one more additional difference must be stated right away, and that is that the international health regulations will come into force automatically. There's no formal process foreseen for a ratification process. If we let things happen as they are wished for by the governments, there is, on the formal level, no ratification process foreseen, and as things are right now, we must expect that 1 year after next May's World Health Assembly, this vote with 50% or more majority, 1 year later, which means 1st of June 2025, these new health regulations will come into force. And now, what do we see from these new pandemic treaty and the international health regulations? If we have to summarize it, which is very difficult to summarize it within 1-2 sentences or 1-2 slides, but I've tried to do so, then we have an overlapping of these two instruments where we can see the following basic key concepts, from which some of them I will take out more explicit after this. Number one, we will see that WHO will become and shall become the legally supreme authority with the authority of issuing legally binding recommendations. So that means only one risk assessment, only one solution, only one standard as defined by WHO will be allowed and shall be applicable. Number two, there's a widening, extreme, unlimited widening of reasons on which WHO shall be allowed to become active under the title of One Health. I will explain it later. Both of these instruments have the clear notion and explicit provisions for an absolute control of information and the concept of censorship exercised by the WHO. Both of these instruments, not just the one or the other. There's clearly there's a notion of electronic total surveillance with the means of the digital health ID. and an authoritarian top-down approach with no mechanism of correction, no mechanism of reassessment, and of of correction, which means no mechanism of checks and balances. Ultimately, as we all know, we don't find one single provision in these new instruments whereby the WHO could be held accountable. To the contrary, WHO and all its officials will enjoy full immunity and tax exemption. Now, let's focus on the international health regulations, and I will give you the most harmful, in my view, most problematic provisions in this context, because they will come into force unless our governments will stop the negotiation process or otherwise will become active. So this is the upper working stream, as I mentioned, where just a simple majority is needed and entering into force 1 year after its adoption in May 2024. And these are the 6 areas that we can identify, and from which, depending on the time, I will just take out the most important ones. Number 1, we see a mechanism of widening self-authorization of WHO by just stating, by just making the case that there is an emergency. As the good practice in clinical trials and production standards, all of these standards will be put aside simply as a consequence of WHO's declaration of a fake. And so also WHO will become the supreme promotion agency of these very same experimental substances. As I mentioned, the recommendations will be mandatory and cannot be corrected. So with such a context, with such a concept, you don't even have to ask about whether fundamental rights can be protected. If you have an authority that can declare emergency at any given time, if you allow this authority to issue recommendations that are in fact orders that must be performed, orders with respect to lockdown, masks, but more harmful orders to take experimental substances based on new technology from specific producers. Then the question about where and how can fundamental rights be protected is simply not anymore possible to answer. So this so-called public health emergency of international concern, the abbreviation, just to save some time, is fake. And this emergency situation shall, to be clear about that, shall be declared by just one single person with the effect of the entire globe, of all 194 countries, or of some region, that can be all European countries. And bear this in mind, what this means to give somebody the power and the authority to just put the entire world into an emergency state without any mechanism of control and without any possibility of objection. And now we see in the proposed amendments even human influenza caused by a new subtype. So any kind of human influenza caused by a new subtype will mandatorily give reason to a mandatory notification to WHO, which then will allow the General Director to declare fake. I continue, and we have seen already in the past, the fake was first declared on 30th January 2020 and was ended on 5th May 2023. So it lasted over 3 years and it was not possible to stop it. Already in the past, it was only the General Director who had the power to decide about declaration and the extension of emergency law. drivers of pandemics such as climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, and increased risks at the human-animal environment. So that will be very, very difficult actually to reduce to specific factual situations, or with other words said, this provision and this concept is open to total abuse, to call fake for any really fake reason. There is, if you want, I don't see any space for making the case that in the future the governments still have some significant liberty to say no, we will not use the PCR. Oh no, we do it with vitamin D instead of using mRNA-based vaccines. I don't simply see any liberty. I just copied out for you the recommendation that WHO can make to require vaccination or other prophylaxis. So yes, such a recommendation will become legally binding. This is a realistic scenario. We will give the power to WHO to make these legally binding orders. And further, there will be committees supervising the implementation of these new rules. And there will not be just one committee, but a second committee, the compliance committee. So, I mean, how strong do we need this proof to understand that the clear target is to give WHO the power to give orders. It's nothing else. WHO, with these provisions, shall be given the power to order top-down with one solution fits for all what WHO pleases to make us do. This is the reality. This mRNA vaccine technology is considered the new gold standard, and WHO promotes heavily already the build-up of infrastructure where, for instance, in Africa already now there is a strong production unit being built in order to build and transfer mRNA vaccines at a large scale. Then you have seen certainly that the WHO and the EU have come to an agreement in June this year to have an international digital health pass established by end of this year, which can easily serve as a precondition for people to, as a condition for the people to allow them or to prohibit them access to all kinds of the public sphere or to the workspace or to banking, whatever it is, this can be abused. Then you have certainly seen earlier this year, I think it was first quarter, this new ICD code, which shall be applied to those who are not vaccinated. They are considered of having a special sickness. The sickness is called you are unvaccinated. There's the special there's the special code. So with one word, WHO has unlimited powers to determine its own solution. One solution fits all, and these directives will directly impact economies, democratic procedures, people's lives and rights, and individually deviating solutions will be made impossible, and even corrections will be made impossible. So our questions, your questions as Member of Parliament to your government should be, well, what are your powers? What will be our powers to end emergency law or to deviate from these top-down orders? And here again, just to remind ourselves, these are the basic principles we shall never forget. We shall always defend against being deactivated or harmed. The right that shall be transferred to WHO to globally define the one sole truth: info control, censorship, and manipulation. WHO calls it infodemics. Why do they call it infodemics? Because their logic is the wrong information is as dangerous as the virus itself. So therefore, we must chase the wrong information and shut it down from the social media. Where can we see that? We see that in the International Health Regulations Amendments proposals, Article 44, literal H. The state parties shall assist each other in countering the dissemination of false and unreliable information about public health events and so on, even activities in the media, social networks, and other ways of dissemination. We have a similar provision in Article 44, paragraph 2, literal E, very similar, and then as well we have this provision being put under the implementation committee's control. As I said, we have the same logic as well in the new pandemic treaty. Article 18, in the current version of 2nd June 2023. There you find, under Article 18, you find that the member states shall combat the infodemic, so wrong information, and tackle false, misleading, misinformation or disinformation, and so on, and that the states shall conduct regular community outreach, shall conduct social listening and periodic analysis in order to identify the prevalence and profiles of misinformation. So that means the lawmakers will have to make here in this country laws that would allow your government to go through all the social networks and actually perform information control and censorship. And so the United Nations, the highest level we have of international organizations, has put some political pressure to already now tackle the problem. And you find, if you go on the United Nations homepage, you find an interview, a very interesting interview, with Melissa Fleming. She is Under-Secretary for Global Communications of the United Nations. And she said, we own the science. Can you imagine? On 3rd September 2022, in an interview, we own the science. In the context, you know, she said, well, we partnered with Google. For example, if you Google climate change, you will, at the top of your search, get all kinds of United Nations resources. We started this partnership when we were shocked to see that when we Googled climate change before, we were getting incredibly distorted information right at the top. So we're becoming much more proactive. You know, we own the science, and we think that the world should know it, and the platforms themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, what kind of mindset does this person have? What kind of mindset does this United Nations group have? I remind you all that without free information, without free speech, there is no science, there is no justice, and there is no democracy. So we must make sure that no negotiations can take place wherever this kind of information control has a place. And just an additional aspect, there is already in place this resolution that was adopted May this year by the World Health Assembly with the purpose to use behavioral sciences for better health and to make best use of manipulative methods to push people into the right way. Please go on to the homepage of WHO. It's called Resolution Regarding Behavioral Sciences for Better Health. And now, again, the constitutional question here is, well, if in the future only one global truth will be accepted and all other voices will be suppressed, If even fear can be spread without limitations, can you as members of this parliament still guarantee the functioning of your democracy, the functioning of your justice and of fair trials? That will be difficult. Now, this is a very brief, a very brief thing to do. This topic, no checks, no balances. There are simply no provisions in these two legal instruments that would allow the member states to exercise some influence to come to a reassessment and to a control and ultimately to a correction. There's none. Now, fundamental rights and human dignity at the end. Well, as I mentioned, it will be quite difficult under such a regime to find an effective way to protect people's rights of self-determination, the rights of people of being correctly informed, if WHO as a clear target wants to define what is the truth and what not. Human dignity, when WHO defines the mRNA-based substances, harmful substances, to be the gold standard for the future, and they declare this into our face even today. Now, all kinds of human rights are here at stake, and most notably, as I mentioned already, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 7, which is mandatory international law. It applies even in time of public emergency, which threatens the life of a nation and is officially proclaimed. Even then, should have all governments informed their people properly about the risks, the heavy risks, and the negative benefit risk. And from what we have seen, these new agreements, they equal to a permanent and to a significant suspension of any member state's constitutional architecture of powers and of its constitutional order, just upon an uncontrolled arbitrariness of a small group of unaccountable officials operating under total immunity. So therefore, please make sure that these two legal instruments will never be signed, will never be accepted, and the process of negotiations should be stopped immediately.